Hello, everyone. Hello. Welcome. Welcome to Cal IT 2. Who here is a UCSD student, faculty, staff, researcher? Amazing. Awesome. Who here is from the community? All right. Who's here is involved in wireless health, either from a research side or a business side? Great, great. Looks like we have a great crowd. My name is Ernesto Ramirez. I'm a PhD student here at UCSD. I work at the Center for Wireless and Population Health Systems, but I'm also the community organizer for Quantified Self, a worldwide collaborative organization of people that make and use self-tracking tools. Today is actually a really good example of a great collaborative effort between many different groups, three that you see here: West Wireless, Quantified Self, the Center for Wireless and Population Health Systems, and also Cal IT 2. I do want to acknowledge before we get started, two people from West Wireless Health that were instrumental. Where is Aaron and Jonathan? Are they over here in the corner? All right. If you have a chance when we're done here, try and shake their hand, thank them. They were instrumental in getting this put together. They were a great team. It was really a pleasure to work with all of them. So to get started, we're going to do a few short introductions to Cal IT 2, to the Center for Wireless and Population Health Systems, and then also to the West Wireless Health Institute. And then we'll introduce the panel and we'll get started. A good thing to know about the panel is it's going to be a nice discussion. It's going to take about an hour long, but we're going to have about 30 minutes for question and answer after the panel. So as they're talking, as they're discussing, as you hear things that pique your interest, remember to write them down or just keep them in the front of your mind, because I'll be coming around with a little microphone and trying to get you to actually answer or ask some questions of our panelists. All right, so first up with some introductions to Cal IT 2 is Dr. Rajesh Gupta. He's the Qualcomm Chair in Computer Science and also the Deputy Director of Cal IT 2.
Welcome. This is 7 p.m. on a Tuesday evening. Normally that means a happy hour. Welcome to Cal IT 2 Happy Hour. It's a special place. I was asked to introduce Cal IT 2. There are many narratives I could give. For example, we raise X amount of dollars in research, actually more than any department in the School of Engineering. In fact, some departments combined. We have more researchers, we have more research, we have more undergraduates, we have a number of programs. But those numbers aside, Cal IT 2 is ultimately about people. So I was scratching my head and thinking as to what I should call Cal IT 2. It's collaborative living. Actually, we are living. It's a dinner time. We're living together and learning in future. If you could imagine, I'm a computer scientist. If you can imagine, what would be a CERN place, the Energy Physics Institute, for a computer scientist like? Well, you are here. That's what Cal IT 2 is. Next slide. Oh, I can use this. Let me give you some narrative, some example. I'll use a narrative that is close to my heart, which has to do with energy. But this is a visualization of a talk. You could call it Larry Visualized. I think I did that. Larry Smart Visualized. On one fine weekend, I think it was in April 2009, our director, founding director, Dr. Smart, gave a talk in which he said, global warming is happening, never mind Wall Street. And what can we do? And we came up with ideas as to where the institutional change can be brought about. Just getting together on a weekend. And then we identify problems. We give a bunch of stickies to a bunch of participants and say, tell us, what can you do? What kind of projects you can do in the next 3 to 5 years? And we go over the projects. We identify, we articulate what the research would be like. The contents of the research, probably the specific topic is not relevant to this audience, but it's close to me, so I want to relate that to you. Where, for example, here, make energy use visible. What will the outcome will look like? What will the success look like? And then you execute. If you are online, type power.ucsd or energy.ucsd, it will take you to the same place. It is monitoring every single watt being used every second on the campus by many buildings, in fact, all buildings. And then, what can you do to make it better? And we built a system. All you need to know is the line that is breaking up is after we deploy our system, we are 1/4 of the energy use than what it was before. Just one machine, but a lot of power savings. That's the kind of impact we do. So it's a place, as I said, for the computer scientists to come out and play. Now, National Academy of Engineering every year goes through this exercise of finding grand challenges in engineering every year. And there are 14 such grand challenges. Those range from solar energy to managing nitrogen cycle to health, to prevent nuclear terror, to do secure cyberspace, and so on. 6 of these are directly related to computing, CHAL IT2, information, and wireless. It is not a surprise that in computer science, faculty in my department are inspired by problems of ballots. In fact, there are probably more papers written in computer science about how ballots could be forced or how could they be made secure than about how computers can be made faster now in the last 10 years. Equity, access, health. These are the topics you would normally not see in engineering, let alone computer science. But that has become our preoccupation today. And in CHAL IT2, we run a number of programs. One of them is called CHAL IT2 Strategic Research Opportunities Program, CSRO. We are starting a new iteration of that program. And in this program, we invite our broader community, folks, researchers who are not engaged with us, to come and play with us. Think about new ideas. In fact, this is the group of projects we funded last year that range from culture, environment, health, energy. You see, health is the largest section. It is no accident. The people who come out and play with us are really inspired by what you can do in healthcare. It's a great time to be. It's a great time to see you. And I'm sure you will have a fantastic happy hour, even without the alcohol. Welcome.
Okay, so our next speaker is actually someone near and dear to me because he's also the director of the lab that I work in. Dr. Kevin Patrick is the professor in family and preventative medicine. He's also the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, which I'd be remiss to say is one of the leading journals in public health these days. And he's also the, like I was saying, director of the Center for Wireless and Population Health Systems. Kevin.
Thanks, Ernesto, and welcome to you all. It's wonderful to see a packed house at this meeting, and again, I've got to give Ernesto a tremendous amount of the credit for this. I mean, he's 99% of what it is that had this happen, so again, many thanks to Ernesto. The secret to all of us as faculty is to get the best possible graduate students to work with us, and that's what really counts. I also want to thank the folks at West Wireless. This is our first event here in CHAL IT2 that's a jointly sponsored event, and it's been wonderful. Again, I think they're a tremendous addition to the institutions on the Mesa here that are focusing on health research and policy, and again, it's been really fun to work with them on getting this off the ground. So quickly, what we are, we're a group of researchers here that work on a variety of health problems. It's a real thrill to be in CHAL IT2 for the reasons that Rajesh just mentioned. Again, this place just eats, sleeps, and breathes a transformative science, and again, it's been wonderful for us to be a member of this community. We have a variety of researchers, many of whom are here tonight, from School of Medicine, School of Engineering, the Supercomputer Center, institutions locally, Scripps, SDSU, and then again, what would we do without our students doing the wonderful work that they're doing? This gives you the corpus of activities. We're doing almost $9 million worth of research this year alone in terms of direct expenses, a variety of projects. And this takes a lot of work on the part of a lot of folks, research staff of 42, and then as you see, the number of folks who have degrees that are helping us. We're also very excited about this new resource that we've just stood up within the last few months here in CHAL IT, the Exercise and Physical Activity Resource Center. Precise measurement of biometric and physiological issues in the context of physical activity and exercise. It's a resource for on-campus researchers and off-campus researchers, and if anybody is interested in this, please do not hesitate to ask us about this. So what do? We actually work, and this is my one slide that sort of gives you an overview of what we do. We work in health, technology, and design. This is really the secret in terms of the future of where what we're talking about is going to go. We've got to bring in the health-related fields. We've got to bring in the technologies and the data-related fields. But we have to have people use these things. And so this issue of design is really critical. And again, one of the foundational things that Cal IT works on is this issue of culture and art. And it's one of the exciting dimensions of what we have here. But I'd like to say we are engineering a new era in public health. And I'm a public health physician. I'm a preventive medicine physician. I really believe that population-level public health approaches are key. And technology has helped in every domain in public health. Clear air to breathe, it takes complicated technology to do this. Clean water to drink, complicated technology that we no longer even pay much attention to. We take it for granted. And safe and healthy sources of food, we take that for granted as well when we go into restaurants or we buy food at the grocery store. So I believe we're at this era right now of moving from an unengineered approach to health to one in which we can have vitality, long life, fun and excitement, and perhaps it's going to be related to what we're going to talk about tonight, and that is the quantified self. Is this really the key? And I think it's a really exciting thing. And if nobody uses this slide tonight except me, I wanted to put this up. This is a well-known science fiction writer, and I love this expression that the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. I have a feeling it's very concentrated in this room here tonight, and I think you're going to be hearing from speakers who are going to talk about that. And I know I've heard all of these folks talk, and it's actually very exciting to think about this. So many thanks for coming. Again, I'm looking forward to stimulating discussion. Many thanks for all of you being here, and on with the show.
Thank you, Kevin. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Joseph Smith from West Wireless. He's the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Science Officer, I believe, at West Wireless Health. Just here to give you a little introduction to what they're doing over there across Torrey Pines.
So I will say that it's great to see you here. We actually volunteered to have you come over to our place, but you got too big. Too many of you showed up. And so I think that's a tribute to the interest and the growth in the space. I can't wait to see what I'm going to say here. We are West Wireless Health Institute. I apologize if it's a little dizzying. This is Prezi. So we're right across the road here. This is the kind of the life's work, really, of Gary and Mary West, two very successful entrepreneurs who, in 40 years of building a business from the two of them to about 35,000 people, could control every attribute of their business, what they bought, what they sold, what they made, but they could not control healthcare costs. And so they view it as their mission and their legacy to address a crisis that's really affecting us all, and that is in healthcare costs. So we are an independent nonprofit medical research organization, started in March 2009. I've been here for about 2 years. And in fact, Eric actually helped to recruit me here. So I'm indebted to one of the audience and one of our speakers for my presence here. He moved me from St. Paul, Minnesota. So I'm very, very happy to be here. What is it we do? It's really all about lowering healthcare costs. That's the reason we come to work every day. It's pretty clear that if you look, if you haven't lived in a cave, you appreciate that we have a crisis in healthcare costs. And it's not just the cost. There's actually a logistical challenge in extending the model of care that we currently deliver to the aging populations in front of us as we age that makes this nearly impossible. And so you've probably seen this graph in many different forms. If you think about U.S. healthcare, it's really extraordinary in spending. It's unfortunately not extraordinary in outcome. And we are like 47th in infant mortality, 50th in overall longevity, but we outstrip everybody in terms of how much we spend. If you try to understand why that is, we talk about our healthcare system. We don't really have a healthcare system. We have a disaster recovery system. We are facing a problem where perhaps 80 to 85% of our healthcare spend is on chronic disease, and yet we think about our healthcare system being hospitals. And the notion of taking care of a chronic disease in an acute care setting is really a manifestation of failure. As opposed to any form of success. We are steeply incentivized to have people in front of doctors. We are incentivized to have patients in beds in hospitals, and actually none of us chooses that outcome. Who is incentivized to keep us well and at home? Well, not our current healthcare system as it's defined. If you don't like the math around the numbers, and I can tell you the numbers are unsustainable on their face, you have to think about what happens if we just go forward in time. When you ask primary care docs, 40% of primary care docs would leave medicine today if they had a viable economic alternative. We have an aging population that will need more and more care, and we will have relatively fewer doctors to manage that. So we need the tools and technologies being developed in this space in particular to be extension of physicians, smarter systems that help us deal with the massive wave of chronic disease that's heading our way in a way that isn't so intensive on the resources we have in fixed locations like hospitals and clinics. So what are the solutions? I think you guys know the solutions. We are living through a convergence of pervasive technologies. So we have the opportunity to take ubiquitous sensing married to wireless connectivity, cloud computing, empowered patients, social networks, smart systems. We can do this for other parts of our lives. When I leave my office every day, I walk past an active wall that shows me what road I should be taking home because it tells me what the traffic is on the 5 versus the 101. How is it that we care so much about our traffic that we don't have that kind of sensors about our diseases? Why don't we know more about ourselves than we know about our cars and our roads? Those are choices we've made, and I think choices we need to make differently. So we profess a notion of infrastructure-independent care, which is really getting care outside of the cathedrals of care with the high priests of medicine, those of us who wear white coats and a stethoscope or an amulet, whatever it is you think it looks like, and try to democratize healthcare and give it back to the enabled and inspired individuals. And so obviously you can do this with wireless health technology as low-hanging fruit, where you can do diagnosis, monitoring, compliance, even pharmacologic titration, all without the face-to-face encounter of a patient with a healthcare system. You guys know all that. That's really, by pushing the button here on this wireless device, I've realized this is the end of my introduction. So thank you very much for the opportunity to play some small role in getting you all together. I'm really very excited about the community and what can come from the really chaotic collisions of inspired individuals such as yourselves to change healthcare.
So once again, thank you, Dr. Gupta, Dr. Patrick, and also Dr. Smith. So I don't have to give him another introduction. Dr. Smith is also one of our panelists here, but I will give some short introductions to our other panelists. Our second panelist is going to be Dr. Eric Topol. Dr. Eric Topol is leading the Scripps Translational Research Institute, again, right across the way on Torrey Pines. He's a leading cardiologist and also what I like to call a digital health evangelist. Hearing him speak at a few different conferences, I think I'm not sure if he remembers this, but in December, I walked up to him and said, I think you inspired me to try and leave the conference and go back to my lab. So inspiring. So really, really appreciate you coming here. Also, we have Larry Smar. He is the founding director of CHAL, a brilliant mind in computer science and computing in general. Also has a very fascinating story involved with quantified self and quantifying his own health over a 10-year period. You might have read it. It was also featured in the New York Times. And then lastly, moderating our panel tonight is Gary Wolf. Gary Wolf is the founder of Quantified Self, an author, writer. Again, you may have read some of his work in the New York Times and in Wired magazine. Let's thank them all for coming.
Thank you. This is terrific to see you. And I will maybe even accelerate getting to questions faster even than Ernesto suggested, because I just want to mention I think this is a very special evening. It is the first time some of these institutions have gotten together to produce an event like this. It's also, in a sense, the last time something like this could happen because we've witnessed this tremendous growth in the culture of self-tracking, collaborative knowledge generation using these technologies, and yet it's still kind of an avant-garde thing. It's just like this is the last second that it's a phenomenon where you could gather sort of all the people who have a keen interest in pushing this forward in a room and have a couple of seats left over. Even in a few months, I think this kind of event would be hard to carry off. So we're at an inflection point. We've watched this with Quantified Self as we've gone from a group of 20 people in studio to 43 cities in 13 countries around the world. We support self-trackers as they attempt to get knowledge from these new tools. And we do that not only because we're inspired by those efforts and we ourselves learn from what other people are doing, but because we see a need to build some reflective capacity and some mediating structures of collaborative knowledge gathering that will help us as the older structures of making knowledge become obsolete in the face of these new tools and methods. So it's an amazing time to be part of this conversation. I really want to welcome you to it. And I'd like to start by doing something that's sort of true to the QS practice, which is to hear a self-tracking story. We have 3 prime questions we always ask at the Quantified Self. It's sort of our research method. We have a really complex research protocol. It goes, what did you do? How did you do it? And what did you learn? It's an anecdote, you might call it. And the anecdote, which is sort of the despised kind of piece of evidence that's considered anti-evidence, I think is going to be the cornerstone of the new knowledge that we're making. So we'll hear from everybody. I'll ask some very orienting questions. We'll have a little bit of discussion and dialogue, and then as soon as I think we've kind of all warmed up enough, I'll open it up to everybody. So we have 3 microphones and 4 people. Let's start with Larry. I should say that I have permission to use first names tonight, which doesn't indicate any lack of respect for the really immense credentials of everybody who's joining me on the stage. But Larry, why don't you tell us a little bit of your self-tracking story? Oh, wait, let me just ask, how many people have read Larry's story of his self-tracking of personal data?
Wow.
Okay, so quite a few. So I think, some people won't know anything, give them a little orientation, but also catch us all up, because the story goes on past the point where it was last published.
Well, I'll try to make it quick. When CAL-ITT started 11 years ago, we had these major focus areas, and one was what we called digitally enabled genomic medicine, because we felt like that even though it was going to be it was $1 billion to get a full human genome then, it would be thousands of dollars now, and we knew this wireless explosion was coming. And as a scientist, I've always dealt with complex nonlinear systems, from astrophysics to all kinds of supercomputing problems, that I could never understand interactions until I really measured them. So like I wanted to understand why the coral reefs were dying. So I actually built my own saltwater coral reef aquarium and worked with it for years. I found that if you didn't put a few drops of molybdenum in to 200 gallons, the coral would peel off because there's a protein that has that molybdenum that is the thing that holds it on rock. So I thought, well, what do I know about my own body? I know more about my coral reef. I know more about my astrophysics than I know about what's inside me. It's the last terra incognita. So I started doing calculations on my body, that is actually measuring first just macro things, weight, heart rate, calories, all that sort of thing. I use that to actually get in much better shape, lose weight, exercise and so forth. But then I began to realize that the blood was really the window into this, and so I started tracking, which ultimately became 100 different variables in my blood, both chemicals and blood types. Then I realized that I'm only 10% me, the human. My cells are 10% of the superorganism I am. The microbes are 10 times as many cells and 100 times the genes. So I started tracking my stool and the variables in that, which are not what are in your blood. I did all kinds of imaging modalities. I spent 3 hours flying through every organ system at a millimeter resolution, from full body scans and so forth. And what I was really trying to do is to understand the state of the system and its evolution in time. For 500 years since Newton, he taught us that you need to know the position at t equals 0 and the first time derivative, and then you can begin to understand the evolution of a system. And so if you don't know your state variables, you don't know you. And so as I did that, I was really just sort of scientifically following my nose. And out of those 100 variables, all of them were more or less within norm, except one, which was my complex reactive protein. And that's the generic measure of inflammation. And I had completely transformed my body, the omega-3 to omega-6 ratios, to bring down the silent inflammation that most obese and overweight Americans have. And so I assumed it would be near, less than 1, which is a standard. It was always greater than 5. And in just the last few months, it went up to 27. And it's I'm chronically inflamed. And I think, well, what? How's that possible? Now, I don't feel chronically inflamed. This idea when you go up to the doctor and the first thing they ask you is, how do you feel? From an epistemological point of view, that's a pretty strange thing to say. And I'm here to tell you that you don't feel a lot of things as they're going wrong in your body. But if you can find them out early enough, you can go back and correct them and bring them back, because your body, everything in your body has got A and anti-A acting, and it wants to be in homeostasis. And if it begins to get out of balance, if you can get it just right back into balance, it's going to be a lot better. Well, I kept going with this, and I found out that eventually I would have my stool variables were, inflammation variables were off scale and so forth. When I would go into my doctor, and had very good doctors, I would show them this, they would say, what's that? And I'd say, it's data. And they said, well, that's kind of academic. That's not useful in a clinical setting. And so my CRP doubled over a few months, and I said, look, something terrible is going on inside of me. And they said, well, do you have a symptom? And I said, no. And they said, well, like, why are you wasting my time? Come back when you have a symptom. And eventually, what I found is that I've got late onset Crohn's, which is an autoimmune situation, which frontier science really doesn't yet understand why, but it involves a genetic predisposition. So I did my SNPs, 23andMe, found out I had one of the interleukins, interleukin 23 receptor is 80% higher than would normally be in. That's a pro-inflammatory thing. I'm now getting the Greg Venner Institute to do the complete the metagenomic sequencing of my stool, because that will give you the gene complex of the microbes, which, among other things, produce anti-inflammation and then help balance you. 80 or 90% of your immune cells are in your colon and your GI tract, and so it, I'm getting to the point that I actually have better quantitative time series of biomarkers than are in the medical research literature on IBD, and I'll have actually probably better microbial metagenomics information that is there, and at that point, I think over the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see a radical change in medicine as the other 90% of the cells in your body are taken into account for the first time in medicine. And this will go back to a lot of bringing Eastern medicine together with Western medicine as well, because a lot of that had to do with thinking of these things that we have put off the table. And so that's where we are. I don't know exactly where this is going, except that I've got better measurements on it, and I feel more confident about knowing the state of my body and where it's going than I would if I wasn't doing this.
So let me highlight a couple of things there that I think are interesting. One is you are kind of a super user, an advanced user for sure. But the fact that the data that you have outstrips the research data, this is an important moment, because as the super user data begins to outstrip the professional data, other users are behind, coming in that wake. And I was talking to Ben Rubin at Zio. They produce a sleep tracking device that many of you have
use it every night.
Yeah. Well, he was saying they have more sleep nights than any academic research laboratory. By orders of magnitude, exactly. And you know, this is, so something is happening in knowledge generating that is very, very significant. The other thing I wanted to highlight is something you didn't mention. You said it in passing in your written account. And I thought it was so interesting. You identified a mystery relating to your diet and weight. Many people hold the theory that weight is determined by calories in, calories out. And you'll find that everywhere in the literature. You've been taking pretty good measurements of calories in and calories out, and you had more calories out than calories in by a substantial margin, and you didn't lose weight. And so to me, this is really interesting. There's an N of 1 here, but you know, this is a really simple dynamic process. It's supposed to be basically mechanics, right? Arithmetic. So where, you know, do you have a theory? If it's not calories in, calories out, what is it?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with your microbes. You know, they actually
consume energy.
The celery you guys were eating, is that cellulose? You don't have a gene in your human DNA to make the enzyme that dissolves, digests cellulose. It's done by the microbes. And if you're on heavy doses of antibiotics and your microbes aren't there, guess what? You're not digesting the cellulose. With the microbes there, you are. Now, it's the same thing in, but there's a lot different is what goes out the other end and what's absorbed into the body, into the bloodstream. So you're a much more complicated system than you would normally think about. And that's, I think, part of the microbes are part of the story in weight gain and weight loss that is not, again, on the table yet, but it will be.
Okay, this is fantastic. So we'll come back to this. Hand the microphone to Eric for a second, because we just got to this problem with, you know, many people see medicine as a kind of recipe book in a way, and the expert's job is to sort of evaluate you and figure out what recipe to apply, which is complex. But the assumption there is that there are recipes, more or less, and that the recipes are correct. And your book, The Creative Destruction of Medicine, raises some questions about that idea of what medicine is and also about what it could be. And I want to ask you a really straightforward question. The creative destruction of medicine, you could say the good destruction of medicine, a destruction of medicine which will lead somewhere else. What do you want to see destroyed in medicine? And then what do you want to see created?
Well, all the medicine that we have today is basically anchored to the population level. So all the guidelines, as you said, the recipes, the screening, the way we give drugs, everything is done based on a population, based on oftentimes large-scale randomized trials, but very little, almost none is attributed to that individual. So with that problem, with that gap, with that chasm that's profound, we really, it's not the liability or the problem of the medical community, but we didn't have the tools, and we do now. That's the big game life changer here, is that we have tools to be able to drill down on any physiologic metric. So in Larry's case, he could basically get a handle, and will get a handle, not only on just genome scanning, but even genome sequencing of not only his germline native DNA, but also his microbiome in his gut. And we couldn't even think about doing that just a year or two ago. And in his particular example of inflammation, that's a little more tough for a biosensor, but we have biosensors for most everything else. So between that and the imaging, which he did have, the total body scans and whatnot, we have ways to understand biology, physiology, anatomy, virtually anything you can think about in any individual, high definition man or woman, this homo digitus we never had before. So it's an exceptional time, and medicine is really at a great turning point. Just because of these new tools, new rules going forward.
Well, what do you see in the medical institutions today, especially I would say in how doctors are trained, that could prepare medicine to be engaged in this dialogue with first the super kind of empowered user, but then with the wider population that comes armed for bear, in a sense, you know? I mean, that comes in with data sets that are bigger than the clinical data sets, that comes in with access to tools of analysis, even basic things like event detection, which are machine-enabled, and says like, okay, doctor, I want you to advise me. We know, I mean, I've been reading the literature on how evidence-based medicine is applied in practice. And we know that the doctors aren't even reading the primary literature. So even they're reading, you know, UpToDate and other sources which summarize that literature. So the patient that comes in with a stack of papers and says, well, doctor, what do you think of this paper? That's a tough thing to get kind of going. That's a tough dialogue to get going. I want you to talk about that because I know you've been so involved in medical education.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem here is you know, having started a med school and trying to deal with the lack of keeping up. You've been kind to say that most doctors, you know, use UpToDate and other measures. They're too busy for the most part. So we have this, you know, knowledge gap, and I think the only way we can conquer this, sure, we need to do things to try to educate the physicians. I mean, there's 700,000 plus physicians in this country, and there's ways to do that, like, you know, the equivalent to the Khan Academy and the open courses MIT and other universities are doing more and more. But perhaps a much better, faster way is to get the consumer, get the public fully loaded with the knowledge that they're the ones that are most vested in their own condition, preventing it or proper diagnosis. And as I said, we have the tools, and that we didn't have that before. But you know, I could show you a couple that you know are transformative, that are basically available now or will be very soon, and that will really, I think, perhaps demonstrate so well that this is, you know, a consumer-based story.
Well,
it's a revolution in health that has to be coming, not from the doctors. It's basically leveraging that model that we learned, the dreadful model of direct-to-consumer pharma advertising, which, you know, I'm totally against. However, we learned it changed medicine because it's the greatest way to drive, you know, new prescriptions, is ask your doctor. Well, if we get that going now with the powers of social networking, and instead of, you know, Arab Spring, it's Health Spring and Occupy Health. We can do this. We can do this, and we can actually get the consumers to drive a far better, higher plane of precision healthcare, and it's just a matter of when now.
Okay, I'm just going to pull, before we go on to Joe, we'll pull a couple of sentences that have been said so far from the stage. One is, if you don't know your state variables, you don't know yourself. I thought that was really memorable. And the other is a kind of Occupy Health. And when you say Occupy Health, you're talking about something that's a process that's ultimately going to be very painful and transformative. Not an easy process, but a process that has confrontational stages and stages of sort of resistance to the way things are currently done. And that would be great, you know, if people have some thoughts about that, that would be great to kind of get into in the questions. Joe, I want to ask you, you're the most, on the panel here, you're the most directly engaged with how healthcare is managed today. Because when you talk about lowering costs, you talk about lowering the costs of the healthcare system that we have today. So for instance, somebody who to lower costs, you have to address people who are patients or potential patients. And you see people as consumers or participants in the healthcare system. I want to ask you what you see as the big wins in lowering costs in terms of new knowledge. I mean, we can lower costs through making the paper move faster through the system and doing things like that, but what new knowledge is available to us through these systems? What diseases or treatments or systems in the body do you think will produce the biggest payoff in the next few years?
Well, it's a tough question. I think you know, people smarter than myself have previously said that prediction is difficult, particularly when it involves the future. And so I wouldn't want to go definitively predict specific events, but I think there's some obvious opportunities and what seems like a unavoidable trajectory toward them. And so you know, you talked rather I think generously about evidence-based medicine. Most of medicine isn't evidence-based. The overwhelming majority is more eminence-based, to steal from my colleague to the right. It is the fact that we do things because we've done them. And so as you imagine that that's going to be less and less tenable, and you've got more and more scrutiny on why is that what's happening to me, or why, doctor, are you doing that as opposed to this, and you peel back the level that says, well, actually, there isn't any evidence to support that. That was merely my historical preference as opposed to my data-driven wisdom and decision-making. I think that will put pressure on what we do, and will ask us to answer some of the questions about dominant practices that are founded largely by history.
Okay, so I'm going to put you on the spot. What dominant practices? Name a couple.
So if you go to your doc at the moment with lower back pain, there's a pretty good likelihood that you'll get some imaging around that. And there's pretty good data that says that no subsequent decisions hinge on the observations made, or at some incredibly low likelihood that those things will happen. But it goes much deeper than the instances of known waste. There's lots of things we do, as Eric was pointing out, that are population-based when we fully know that 30 or 40% of the people to whom we provide such therapies derive no benefit and experience all the costs and all the adverse consequences. And all it takes is understanding what are the genetic determinants, or what are the historical determinants, or what are the epigenetic determinants that say that that therapy in you actually won't work. And so skip that. And so the opportunity to take expensive, potentially life-saving therapies and only give them to the 30 or 40 or 50% of a cohort that deserves them by virtue of having some positive impact, I think saves then half of the expense. Estimates in terms of known waste are in $700–800 billion a year. The things we don't yet know, I think, are larger, because we're doing things which are in the guidelines, but peel back a layer and you realize, well, those guidelines are derived largely from apocryphal suggestions in remote history, right? So I think there's a tremendous opportunity as we put pressure on the system to justify why we do what we do. Importantly, though, I think we have a system which has a bandwidth limitation living at the doctor, right? We can't keep up with the onslaught of information. We can't keep up with the patients we have to see. We're not really good at even figuring out which of the patients we're responsible for we need to see at a particular time. And so as one elevates this to realize that, okay, maybe I shouldn't be making those decisions because I can't comprehend all the diseases that my patients have. They're presenting me information I don't yet know how to interpret. Maybe we need to offload that to smart systems. Every other technologically sophisticated endeavor that humans have participated in have an opportunity to use massive information technology, smart algorithms to look at that. You can take your car in and the mechanic no longer goes, let me see what's wrong with your car. No, they plug it in with a chip and they go, look at that. It turns out that one cylinder's off by a little bit. Let me go fix that for you. And so why can't we do that to us? We have to do it to us because we're bandwidth limited at the moment. And so we have to move to that. And that offers, I think, a great opportunity for saving.
Okay, so this is a good jumping off place for another part of the discussion that I wanted to have with you three. But before I do, I will just now underline the guidelines are based on apocryphal suggestions from remote history or ancient history. That's another kind of great line that we can say from a highly credentialed medical expert. What I want to ask about is the difference between cars and people is that cars are engineered with a blueprint. So cars at the stage of engineering come with the diagnostics built in, whereas humans don't come with those diagnostics built in. And when I look out there in the world of sort of smart systems and algorithmic medicine, I see more complicated recipe books or more efficient recipe books. And I wonder if that's going to get us there. And the conversation I think we could have is, what counts as evidence? Because if you want to improve the recipe book, you need theories, and then you need some evidence to support the theories. We have evidence today, medical evidence, randomized control trials are the kind of gold standard of evidence. The data that we're going to be gathering is going to be different kinds of data. what are the standards of evidence we're going to use? What are the processes that we'll use to sort of say about something that is evidence, that's valid evidence? Are we nowhere with that? Are we somewhere? What's the state of the art?
I'd love to have Eric take that one.
Well, I think a good example is what we're seeing in the startup world. This microphone is unreliable. Yes, it is. Yeah. That's an accurate statement. So if you look at, it was mentioned Zeo. So I've worn a Zeo headband that tracks every 30 seconds the state of your sleep. Is it awake, light, dark, deep, or in REM for a year? I've worn a body media device that measures my caloric burn, three-dimensional accelerometry, galvanic skin response, heat flux through the skin, skin temperature for a year. That was all in the cloud now, uploaded into a computer cloud with tens of thousands, maybe more. And that data is now the largest population-based distribution of data that ever existed in sleep or in caloric expenditures. It will soon be in the hundreds of thousands. After that, it'll be in the millions and tens of millions. The same goes with a lot of these things. I don't expect people to do what I'm doing, but with the miniaturization of chips to where a single drop of blood, according to the vision Lee Hood has in Seattle, is that you would be able to measure 2,500 vital chemicals, 50 for each of your 50 most important sub-organs in the body. So the cerebrum is different than the cerebellum, is different than the adrenal gland, is different than the kidney. And each of those has 50 different ones you're monitoring with one drop of blood. Now, what happens is once that data is in the cloud at that scale, software, for the first time ever, can be applied to it. And learning theory and artificial intelligence is going to be able to begin to determine actual norms, interactions, relationships between those data, and give you personally, as an individual, completely individualized feedback as to not only the state of your body, but where you sit relative to everyone else and what you might do differently. So there's coaching, there's self-help kind of teaching algorithms that you personally do. In 2 8-minute visits a year to your doctor, which is the American average, you will never be able to do that. In the 365 days a year that you live inside your body, you are going to have way orders of magnitude more time to investigate how you might change your behavior. Eat differently, exercise differently, sleep differently, stress less, and end up being a much healthier person. And in the background are these, every time another data goes up, all of us are enriched. It's the network effect. And that's only now possible because of these smart wireless devices, our smartphones, the cloud, and all the stuff that Eric so beautifully describes in his new book.
Just to, Gary, your question, I think, too, was, okay, you can start the car building it, designing it from the ground up and put in all these diagnostics. But we can do that in people, too. That is, first of all, we don't even take advantage of all the carrier gene mutations when people are planning to have a child, and that data is hardly used today. It should be. And not only that, but we have almost every, autosomal recessive dominant sex-linked trait, almost every mutation nailed now, and we could easily do that to come up with a much better, to avoid these horrible rare diseases. Now, secondly, when we can sequence the whole genome of a fetus in the first trimester, and so you would know before the baby's born, well before the baby's born, that baby is a high risk to develop insulin-dependent, autoimmune diabetes. That's a horrible disease which takes 5 years to knock out your pancreas, islet cells. We could have an embedded sensor in that would be put in, that sensor, just like you're talking about in a car, but we're putting in after the fact because we know that baby or child has a higher risk. Know when to give immunomodulation therapy to block. There's no reason that we should have autoimmune diabetes, as an example. There's many things like that. So this thing could start really early. And the point is, whether it's wearable sensors or embedded sensors, coupled with genomics, we can change this thing around. There's no reason why people have to have heart attacks, which is the #1 killer still in the world, or really strokes. Once we get the sensors going, once we find out who are the people at risk, we haven't used this information, and it's basically ready to leverage.
Yeah, interesting. So, genetic engineering on the fetus before birth to, reduce the chance of disease. Yeah. I want to ask you what you think of self-experiments. Can anything be learned from self-experiment, and what's its utility?
So I think medicine has a long and rich history of innovations taking place because thoughtful and courageous people did experiment on themselves. I mean, Eric and I are both cardiologists, and much of interventional cardiology got its start by brave souls willing to experiment on themselves. I studied electrophysiology. One of the fathers of cardiac electrophysiology died in his lab experimenting on himself. And so I think there's great value at a particular moment to ask a question that can be courageously answered by an individual at a moment in time. I think there's also a great peril in providing a healthcare system with novel information about you that it is unprepared to deal with. And so an example would be, we're very good at interpreting what it means when your blood pressure is measured 3 times a year, and putting you in you have normal blood pressure or you have high blood pressure and giving you medicines. I think we're not all the way good yet if you're measuring your blood pressure constantly, and you get put up in front of a crowd of 200 people and asked a question you don't know how to answer. What happens to your blood pressure at that moment? It may be well outside the norm. That doesn't mean that you are outside the norm. It's that measure is outside of a norm constructed with very different information. And so I think we have to be cautious about how we interpret novel information against a backdrop which didn't contemplate that level of information. And so I think, I would not want to advocate everyone go home and experiment on yourselves. There's some really sharp things in your medicine cabinet and see where they'll fit. I wouldn't want to advocate that. But I would also say even the things that apparently are relatively innocuous to measure, if you bring them to a healthcare professional well-versed in the way we currently practice medicine, you may have an untoward event by virtue of kind of misguided interpretation.
You are a father of quantified self, but that's not, of course, experimentation. That's surveillance,
right,
and collecting data. So there's a little risk, which is great. But I think that getting away from experimentation, which kind of denotes a risk in that, if you start to think about just getting data and information on oneself, it has remarkable impact. So I started wearing this glucose sensor, okay? And this can go right to the phone. And what's amazing about how it changes your life is, so I'm just turning this phone on now, 7:54, and my glucose right at this moment, 7:54, is 96, okay? Now, if there's a cookie in front of me, and I know if I eat that cookie, which I've tried this, and I'm gonna have my glucose shoot up, I might not eat the cookie. Or I might, certain things that I now have learned for me, result in marked jumps in glucose, like pizza and what other ones, some really high carbohydrate loads. Well, all of a sudden, for me, I'm learning what foods to avoid, what exercise does to my glucose, and I don't want to become a diabetic. My father died of diabetes, and I don't really want to go there. No less, half my patients have diabetes, and 400 million people already on this planet have diabetes, and over 1 billion have pre-diabetes. This is the kind of thing that can really change. So the whole idea of quantified self applied to something as simple as glucose could make a world of difference if people train themselves for their own lifestyle.
Yeah, I'll just share some of what I see going on at the Quantified Self as kind of to add to this discussion. people are beginning to see themselves as self-experimenters, but they're beginning, of course, most people, with things which are not very risky. So they frame this question of what effect will it have on me if I change the timing of my dose of my vitamins or supplements, for instance. They see that as a self-experiment. If I eat that cookie, let's see what happens to my blood glucose. That's framed or understood as a self-experiment, and it's a little bit like a gateway drug, because once you learn something, learning something is a very powerful reward, and people and animals like to be rewarded. So, you know, that in a sense is we talk a lot about feedback loops in this area, and the feedback loops are often based on a kind of sort of primitive notion of human motivation where we're going to pay you something or we're going to shame you and you're going to, well, the learning is a neglected component of that feedback loop. And here's where we may get somewhere with self-experimentation. Both the knowledge is useful, but also the kind of the drug of learning. You know, this is interesting too.
But I think, you know, this word self-experimentation is a scary word. It's like a Frankenstein word. Look, when you exercise, you are experimenting with your body, you know? And when you have, like I exercise on elliptical, and I like to do intervals between 70 and 80% of my maximum heart rate, and that biofeedback is what keeps me going. And I'm experimenting. Can I go up to 80% of my heart rate? Can I come back down? And I'm gradually training my heart as a muscle the way that you would any other kind of muscle. And by keeping track of what you're doing, you know, I doubled or tripled my strength from when I came here 10 years ago by just carefully getting involved with, I have a trainer, Terry Martin, over at UCSD. And she, you know, said, well, let's try this. That's experimenting, and it's changed my body completely. And coming back to what Eric said, you know, there is no solution to the medical problem outside of a massive increase in individual responsibility for your own body. Now, how do you have responsibility if you don't have data and feedback, if you don't know where you are? How many of you would go home tonight driving a car with the dashboard blank? No speedometer, right? I mean, you'd sort of, well, I sort of think I know. There's a reason there's a speedometer. In fact, I've been driving, you know, for 40 years. I still want my speedometer. And it's because you need that quantitative feedback to know where you are and where you're about to go. And that's the promise of this revolution. The glucose, I love your glucose sensor. I want to get one. I'm not. I knew you would. You're going to steal mine. Well, I got that geek jealousy thing happening right now. I hate it when somebody else has a better toy than I do first. But this is very important. The most critical thing that would change healthcare in the world is for people to think about what they're about to put in their mouth. You know, the diabetes numbers you gave us, CDC says by 2030 we're going to have a third of our American population with active type 2 diabetes because there's 3/4 overweight or obese. How'd they get that way? One bite at a time. And so the point to this is with these tools, there's a new app. You just take a picture with your smartphone of your food. It comes back with those profiles that you see in the store that tell you how much fat. I am religious about thinking about how many grams, I won't get into that, but anyway, of fat, protein, and carb I'm about to ingest. Is there sugar in this? How much fiber is in it? And once you think a little bit about it, this learning happens. Okay, and you're a different person, and over time, your health improves. But we've got to get to that individual level, or else 2 8-minute visits to the doctor a year isn't going to cut it.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, working off this, and then I'm going to go to your questions, as I promised. So please get them ready, and we'll do our best to get as many in as possible. I know that there are some stirring. At the Quantified Self, we see a lot of hope, people coming with hope that they will be able to intervene in this cycle of obesity through feedback about what people eat. And I know the data on intervening there is not very good over the long term, and a lot of things have been tried over many, many decades. What your paper that you wrote about your self-tracking, what struck me there was this notion that maybe a behavioral analysis is inadequate. And this is especially interesting to talk about right now in the conversation because it relates to sort of individual responsibility and where that connects with a kind of environmental or social environmental context for what we do. We're putting a lot of things in our mouths, and one of the things we're putting in our mouths is a lot of antibiotics, for instance. And your paper suggested, sort of in passing, but in a very kind of provocative way, because when you've been tracking the microbes in your gut, and you've noticed that when you took a course of antibiotics, of course it killed them all off, but the good bacteria took 4 years, am I right, to come back, basically?
2 to 3 years.
2 to 3 years to come back. So you were disturbing that system in a major way. And you mentioned in passing that there's some evidence that this may connect with obesity. And this just makes me think, you know, everyone's looking for the answer in terms of individual behavior. What if the answer is not there? What if the answer is somewhere else?
You guys.
No, I think that the whole idea, the notion that the microbiome of the gut, I mean, there's a microbiome all throughout our body, it has already been established pretty well that it has an interaction with risk of diabetes, with immune diseases. Why not? Would it have a risk for obesity? I mean, I think it's been underestimated as to its importance. Just like the epigenome, you know, everybody's talking about now we can sequence the whole DNA, 6 billion base pairs in 2 hours for, you know, for free or for less than $1,000. But that doesn't even get us to the epigenome, which is, as we've learned, very, very important. And it's different in every tissue, every cell. So there's the complexities of these other parts of what makes an individual, like the microbiome, the epigenome. You know, there are a lot of things here that are going to take a while. And I think, you know, we spoke earlier today. I wouldn't even try to, you know, use the current, this approach of this precision participatory medicine to try to tackle obesity. That's, as you, I think, characterized the moonshot. I think it's beyond the moonshot, but I think there are a lot of other things that are much more attractive that we could get to with our tools now.
Right. I mean, it's easy. I mean, I want to hear Joe's point of view. We were just to share a little bit of this conversation. We were talking about fighting tobacco, and tobacco. This is kind of a limit case. We made a lot of progress on tobacco through some behavioral approaches, but a lot of other approaches. For instance, we locked up every cigarette in the state behind a counter and made it illegal to smoke inside a building or within a, you know, like these, you can't lock up all the food. So if you just look at tobacco and ask, like, what did we have to do to make progress on tobacco, you see right away that, you know, that obesity is not going to be tackled that way.
Yeah, I mean, to give some hope that we will make some seminal observation that will give us great insight into obesity. I think it wasn't very long ago that we all knew that peptic ulcer disease was an issue really with just hyperacid production until someone said maybe it's got a bacterial underpinning. And that, you know, that one researcher was ridiculed until finally he was proven to be correct. And then we changed overnight the incidence of peptic ulcer disease and its management and surgery for it, all because, you know, somebody had, you know, the courage, again, their self-experimentation is what gave rise to, you know, a credible story which then changed, revolutionarily changed healthcare, and that was, you know, a, you know, heretofore relatively unrecognized bacterial component that was playing a dominant role. I do want to say something else about self-experimentation. I think it got brought up as if that's what you all are doing, and don't we need to be a little bit concerned about that? And what's going to happen when we all do this more? I think there's a different context. Healthcare is a continuous experiment. The current platform for healthcare delivery in the United States is a burning platform, and so experimentation isn't just interesting, it's required. We can't do what we're doing anymore, so we have to do something different. And if you don't believe that healthcare that you're getting today is an experiment, talk to anybody who runs a teaching hospital in July, when you're taking brand new medical students and giving them the credentials of doctor and having them take care of people for the first time. And so it is a longitudinal experiment. Every time you put something in your mouth, that's an experiment of how you'll deal with that. Every time you go to a different restaurant, every time you go to a different doctor, every time you decide that it's not okay to tell them that you smoke marijuana, and so you hide that from them, that's an experiment in how they will then interpret what else is right or wrong with you, given that that piece of information has been deleted. And in fact, much of the information that's relevant to you is chronically deleted because we don't yet measure it. And so we have an ongoing experiment. It's not the choice of experiment or not. It's really a question of, do you want to experiment with more data or less? So I don't see this as, we need to be so careful about the notion of experimentation in healthcare. It's an imperative, and it's actually continuous and ongoing even in the moment.
Okay, let's open it up. Oh yeah. Yeah, sure. Take two. Yeah.
And identify yourself.
Okay, I'm Rajesh. The surest way to make sure that your doctor looks at you as some kind of a nut is to tell him or her that you have data about yourself, about your markers. And the surest way to get that certificate is to actually take the data to the doctor. Then they know you're certified. To me, as a computer scientist and as a builder, building these devices and doing these fancy things and putting the data onto the web and doing things, this will happen. It's already happening. There is no barrier there. The biggest barrier, really, is how healthcare is practiced. And I'll tell you, and maybe my looks are such that I look like stupid, but when I talk to the doctor and I tell my doctor, can I look at my own report? They look at you as if you were, I don't get my report. In fact, I'm still waiting after 3 weeks of filing the release form, I won't identify the clinic system, to get my data. So what has gone wrong, or what is the issue where, as a teacher, I do not treat my students as if not capable of reading their own grade report? But that's what we have.
Well, I wanted to say something good about doctors, and this is a good opportunity. I have learned an enormous amount by partnering with doctors. Doctors have an amazing level of experience that I don't, and that is very valuable. It's a different thing that I'm bringing to the table with my data. And it's like in any field of work, there are earlier adopters and late followers. And so I've found doctors who are intrigued. And yeah, I probably do think I'm a nut, but they are listening, and then they become a collaborator with me. And I think that's where we're going. I don't think it makes any sense for all of us without having medical education to think we are now doctors because we can measure some things about ourselves. And so I want to make sure that everybody knows that my view is that you want to have the best possible doctors as your collaborators, but that they are really busy, maybe doing 6 operations a day, and they don't have a lot of time to spend with you. You are the only person that have that time. And so if you haven't done your part of the work, and then you bring that to the collaboration, and they bring having seen 20,000 patients that you've not seen to the collaboration, then you have something very special. And that's where I think we're going. One last thing I'd just say is we're blessed here in La Jolla to have so many world-class biomedical research environments and schools of medicine and so forth. And if we cannot be the first in the world to develop and train a whole new generation of doctors in this emerging field, then, you know, shame on us.
Well, you know, Raj, I wanted just to expand a bit. I think Larry is absolutely right about partnership guidance from physicians. However, what you're talking about is real, and that is because medicine as a community, as a profession, is ultra conservative, and also really, in many respects, so resistant to change. And so the challenge now, and it's going to happen, as you say, more and more, is that each person will have this data set that they have from their phone, they have from their DNA sequence, et cetera, and it's very threatening to a physician for that person to be armed with all this information now. And in fact, what happens is we have this old school of the medical priesthood. We have the problem of doctor knows best. And all of a sudden now, patient knows a lot of stuff. And so this is very tricky because right in the last month, there have been the top tier journal articles have published, for example, in JAMA, should patients have access to their laboratory tests? I said, what? Okay, there was a Wall Street Journal big whole issue about controversies in medicine. Should doctors be emailing with their patients? I said, duh. You know, how about 15 years ago we were doing this? You know, but still a big controversy. And I can go on. And there was an Annals of Internal Medicine, a big lead article, 3 of them. Should patients have access to their medical notes, office visits, and charts? I said, what? So this is all you're seeing in 2012. These were all just published in the last few weeks. And even the American Medical Association is trying to do everything to the FDA and the government to prevent access to one's DNA data unless it's mediated by a physician. That is unacceptable. And that's the AMA, which represents not the majority, but a substantial number of physicians in this country. So we have some problems to achieve this kind of partnership collaboration that we have to aspire to, because that's what it ultimately has to go toward.
So before we have the next question, let's just try and state your name and where you're from, and then we have lots of questions, so let's try and keep the questions a little bit brief. Thank you.
Got it. I'm Dave Teitler from physics department here. I work in astronomy. I'd like to hear your opinions on how the availability of personal data will change drug development, availability, approval, et cetera.
So I can try. Before having this wonderful job, I used to run emerging technologies at Johnson & Johnson. And so I have a view that comes partly informed from that experience. I think in an ideal sense, you would love to take into account a lot of data that isn't structured as you think about early reports of experimental drugs and the impact that they have. Our systems are not yet set up to peel through unstructured data. The systems are very clearly organized over what data do you want, how are you going to collect it, make sure that you've really got that, how does that link to the questions you're going to propose that you've answered to the FDA, how are they going to interpret that data. So we have a big machine that already clearly speaks to very specific data sets. The notion of trying to collect much, much more data, use natural language processing, peel through those records, and then be smart enough to recognize the question you weren't smart enough to ask and get an answer to that early, I think is, in the minds of some, the holy grail about how we're going to do this. But if you're a pharmaceutical or medical device executive in the moment, that concerns you greatly, because you will make observations you do not know how to interpret, and vagary is the antithesis of regulatory speed. And so if you show up with lots of bits of data that you can't interpret, the regulator responsible for approving your application will slow in their ability to accept what you've done. And so we don't have a machine yet geared to take into account that very vital information that is then somewhat less structured.
Talk about speedy development and then rapid reevaluation.
Well, I mean, I think we've already seen, you know, just last week there was this drug called Calideco approved for cystic fibrosis, and it was done in record time. It was done in a total of 120 children, and it had a eureka effect. And so these children were picked because they had a specific mutation. Not all of cystic fibrosis, but a very small subset. And that's a disease where the gene was cracked in 1989 by Francis Collins. When I was at Michigan, it was a momentous discovery, and it took all this time. But the whole idea was understanding, you know, that you can couple a particular genetic disruption with a particular intervention and do small trials. N of 1 trials even would be suitable if you have the right data with a very striking, overwhelming response. So we got to get out of this mindset of studying, you know, tens of thousands or thousands of people with this eking out a small benefit, and we have to get a supportive regulatory body to allow this to happen. And finally, we have this incredibly risk-averse system in this country. If we get drugs and devices and diagnostics on the market, conditionally approved with then big numbers, you know, basically under digital surveillance, very tight surveillance, then you can make a much better call in the real world. We don't do anything in the real world. Everything that's done with approval is done in this very controlled research setting, which is not reflective, and that's why a lot of things blow up when they go into the real world population.
Good, let's take some more.
This is Daryl Drinan with Philometron here locally. Love to have your thoughts and comments on, we're talking about objective data, we're talking about these highly sensitive, specific tests that are one-offs or are going to become continuous. But what about the subjective part? We briefly hit on the behavioral aspects of this. How is that going to be influenced by the social networks and these systems?
Well, James Fowler, you know, is here at UC San Diego, and he was the one who was profiled in the New York Times about how, looking at social networks, you can see how, you know, obesity or thinness or other kinds of things are literally transferred through your social networks. I personally think social networks are one of the most radical reasons for hope of any technology that's out there. Everything we do as human beings, you know, at the end of the day, we look around and see our, you know, what do our friends think and how do we relate and so forth, because we're social animals. We have evolved as social animals. It's deep in our genes that we are social animals. And before the social networks, we didn't have a way to get that feedback. So my sense is, I can just tell you that personally, as I never expected to tell anyone about what I was doing, but as it sort of has leaked out, and gradually I've started talking about it because it was out anyway, there's this expanding set of people around me who are changing to a much healthier body themselves. And so there's an inspirational social network effect. And it's the opposite of what Valerie was talking about the negative social effect of obesity. It's going in the other direction. And I think that the combination of your personal biofeedback, posting that, making it visible, you know, a lot of people won't do something if everybody knows they're doing it and they know it's probably not the right thing to do. And if your friends are saying, you know, you can almost all these things like Fitbit, you know, so I'm, you know, I'm a real wuss today, but you know, I've gone less than 2 miles, and so, but then that you just hit Facebook or Twitter or whatever, and that's posted. And so we have a little competition among friendly competition just in our director's office, and it's expanding out across Cal IT2 of just, you know, how many steps a week are you doing? And boy, I don't like the fact that I look so stupid. I got to do more steps. And that's social network effect. So I think that's something we haven't had before. It's free. Free. Talk about lowering cost of medical. That's a good one. Free.
You got it.
So we actually, building on this question of behavior, we actually have a question from someone watching the live stream via Twitter. And going up to the Bay Area, seeing what's developed with Quantified Self, there's this big movement. And Gary talked a little bit about feedback loops. And there's this movement towards bringing games and game mechanics. If any of you are familiar with Jane McGonigal and her work. And the question from Steve Epstein on via Twitter is, can doctors find a way to learn how to use games or mHealth games or game mechanics with their patients that aren't gamers, people that aren't sitting at their computers or at their Xboxes or PlayStations?
So I think you are watching the gamification of healthcare, that you're watching as game creators have made opportunities for kids with diabetes to learn particular games that educate them about their food choices, and real data derived from that you get beneficial impacts in hemoglobin A1C, hard endpoints driven by kids playing games. I have a good friend who talks about we really need a game that would be great for making kids active and preventing diabetes. And her answer is, we already have that. It's called soccer. You actually don't need to have this happen with your iPhone and your iPad. There are actually games like baseball and soccer. You can go out and play those, as it turns out, outside. You don't have to emulate them on a screen with Kinect. Yeah, so all of that's good. But I do think we are at the beginning of understanding all of the ways that the different tribes among us get motivated. And getting a little text message from myself at dinner time to say, hey, don't eat the muffin, isn't probably as handy for me as an avatar of my kid saying, if you don't eat the muffin, maybe we can play catch together or something. So that everyone will have their particular sets of carrots and sticks that'll motivate them differently. And we're at the beginning of understanding those motivational cues and building them into games. But I think you can readily work your way toward a world where you have prescription games and prescription software to help you deal with a particular challenge that you have. And I'll tell you, my office gets besieged by entrepreneurs who have this idea. This actually is a little bit easier to swallow than those who say, I've got this great idea and it's about, I'm going to measure something and send this real time to your doctor all of the time. Because while that may be attractive to many of you, it's not attractive to many of our colleagues to think about managing 1,000 patients and streaming live data on all of them all of the time. That's not a definition of a great day, right? So just to be aware.
We have another question, and I just want to encourage you to bring your best critical and reflective mind here, and just to kind of prime you, because at the Quantified Self, and I think among all our dialogue, we like to kind of go beyond where we already are, and some words that come out and really engage discussions are things like pressures for conformity, surveillance and privacy, cybernetic naivete that drives people towards sort of a proxy endpoint that's supposed to lead somewhere else, but actually is super negative. If you want to read a really great book about that, read Joe Flood's The Fires, about the cybernetic optimization of the New York Fire Department by the Rand Corporation in the 70s that led to the burning down of an entire neighborhood in New York because they optimized on some naive metric. So just to kind of give you permission to think critically about what we're talking about.
Hi, Jesse Nadora with the Moores Cancer Center and the UCSD School of Medicine. The Tohono O'odham Nation in southern Arizona probably have some of the highest obesity rates and diabetes rates in the world. They're very poor, like many other American Indian First Nation folks around the country. As most of you know, the poor have the worst health outcomes. The poor have the worst health literacy, much less functional literacy or numeracy. Dr. Smar suggested that self-knowledge, I think all of you are actually suggesting that detailed self-knowledge can lead to behavior change. That's what's being suggested. So my question is, why is having detailed self-information sufficient for a positive lifestyle change, especially for very complex things like eating, something you do on a day in and day out basis, or addiction? I think tobacco is a very good example. So that's my question.
And this is a really good question. I'm going to pass it to these guys, but I will just echo that at the quantified self, where people are actively experimenting and doing a lot of self-tracking, it's not at all clear that the consensus is that detailed self-knowledge leads to something called behavior change, which leads to positive outcomes. There's something else happening, and something that might be described as like reflection, learning, collaboration, social support. There's much more complex phenomenon. But I think that question is very, it's a very meaningful question. You might even ask, on a theoretical level, whether there is such a thing as behavior. I mean, behavior, this is a very large class of things. What's in it and what's not in it in human life? I mean, this is a category that could use some examination.
Well, you know, the indigenous people around the world have gone through this phase of becoming obese, and basically since the introduction of the Western diet, of foods that are not appropriate for their genetic makeup. And many of the indigenous species people are from not involved in the river valleys, where things like lactose and glucose tolerance arose once you could cultivate grains and domesticate animals. A large fraction of African Americans, for instance, are lactose intolerant because they didn't go through this phase that made freaks of most of us that were lactose and glucose tolerant, because we happen to come descendants from the river valleys where we had to learn how to do that. Their health went to hell once they started having compared to the hunter-gatherers. And so I think the first self-knowledge is that the indigenous foods that were grown for millions of years, actually, before this happened, are the right mix, and we should be going back to that. But the global food industry, and in particular in this country, has led to making things that are not good for you cheap, and that just you know, the thing that I finally came to understand about nutrition is that we are biochemical entities that have evolved over millions of years, and therefore, if you put something into that biochemical machine, it's going to have a certain laws of physics consequence. And it's not random. You can't put water in the gas tank of your car and expect it to work very well just because you want to. You know, I feel hungry for water, so I'll put it in my car. You know, get it. So I think that one of the health disparities, which are horrible, right now the obesity epidemic is centered in the South, and a lot of that has to do with the, I think, the interaction between genetics and food in a number of different subcultures that evolutionarily have developed over the last several 50, 100,000 years, and we ought to be aware of that. I mean, it's wrong what we're doing with the way that the food is being, so-called food is being given to people that is obviously ruining their health. And you're seeing a lot of pushback on that. A lot of the effort, like in Detroit now, is a good example of a food desert. There is inside of the boundaries of Detroit abandoned property greater than the size of Manhattan Island. 80% of people are getting their food from 7-Elevens or gas stations. And fresh vegetables essentially are just non-existent. But there's a whole pushback of growing vegetables in all this abandoned land and distributing that to people who've not had it, low-income people. And you see Michelle Obama trying to teach low-income kids in Washington, D.C. about the advantage of growing your own vegetables. I grew up growing all of the vegetables that I ate. Never went to the grocery store to buy a group. I mean, what would you do that for? And so I think there is a move backward to this, but until we break through this food system that we've created, you're going to continue to see these health disparities, I think.
Just quick answer, I don't think we can change behavior too readily. I think, so for example, if you have high blood pressure, you're monitoring your blood pressure, half the people we know don't have it controlled. That's the sort of thing that's very amenable to this. I don't know that we're at the behavioral modification. That's so darn difficult. But maybe at some point.
Tom Meineke, I'm one of the original developers of the VA VISTA electronic medical record system and the Department of Defense composite healthcare record system. I've been experiencing the government helping healthcare for many decades now, and watching that HHS and VA DoD are about to spend about $50 billion at least on what I consider to be massive turbo centralization and massification of a monolith, which is the opposite extreme of what Eric is talking about with personalization, which I think is where we definitely have to go and why it's so exciting to be in San Diego with this kind of thinking. Do you see the same gap as I do about HHS pulling us into massification of the disease industrial complex and us needing to go to personalization and quantified self? And that's not a loaded question.
No, I am totally with you. This is a big problem. So, for example, they have this new agency or $1 billion for comparative effectiveness research, comparing a population versus another population with intervention. All the things that are being done now, this accountable care organization to reward health systems for population health. We got some problems here. All the things that are the large expenditures in this health plan going forward are not recognizing what we've been talking about this evening. And that's scary to me. And I don't know how, again, if we don't get the consumer health revolution going to turn this around, we're going in the wrong direction. And that's very, very scary to me.
My name is Jim Dunford. I've been on the faculty of the emergency department at UCSD for 32 years. And I feel that, the ER is sort of ground zero for healthcare reform. Everything I see seems to circle around, what needs to get fixed. And the people that I see the need greatest for are not the people that could do what the things you guys are talking about. It's the exact opposite end of the spectrum of our society. They're the most vulnerable people. They have mental illness, they have substance abuse, they got chronic diseases, they've been impaired by strokes, and they are also the ones that are causing that skyrocketing cost. It's not you guys in this audience that are costing society the money. It's the dual eligibles. It's the people that have Medicare and Medicaid. Those are the people that we have to do something about first. But like Eric said, a lot of those are behavioral issues. So I'd like to sort of challenge you guys to say what kind of monitoring devices, what type of social network, because these are people who they don't have good insight and judgment. I mean, when I go to the jail, 50% of the patients have mental disease. You talk about a healthcare cost. The people that you see down there are all bipolar, schizoaffective disorders and worse. And those people are all costing a fortune. So what are we going to do about the people that cost most?
Okay, I'd like to just respond with a couple of things that are little anecdotes. One is I think the caregiver is a key component of the problem that you just described. And so, for instance, a friend of mine is a nurse in a big public hospital in an urban setting. The question is, she's in a wound care clinic. So what's the antibiotics you use when the person has a wound? Well, that depends a little bit on your prediction about whether they're going to come back and care for their wound. And you have to address that person, but that person may not be capable of predicting their own behavior at the next stage of their wound care. It's the caregiver there, but that information is not very well harvested. So I think just there on this question of data, it's not just the person, but it's also the person and the people who care for them, whether that's somebody who loves them or that's somebody who's professionally obligated to care for them. On the monitoring, you mentioned something that kind of triggered me, because there are some fantasies about turning the quantified self type of devices into remote monitoring devices that are imposed on individuals whose care costs a lot of money. And this is, I just want to reflect that is an idea that's out there. I happen to know the guy who did the first radio electronic monitoring in the 60s, actually, using some very unwieldy equipment. He thought it would be for working with what they then called juvenile delinquents to help them achieve their own goals by giving them kind of Skinnerian rewards for showing up at their appointments and doing things. He had a whole pilot, it was published, wonderful thing. That became electronic ankle bracelets in the prison and parole, in the prison to parole system. And so it became a surveillance and a punishment technology. And I visited with the prisons with him, or the monitoring offices where people came in to talk to their parole officers and their monitors. And you could see that this had become a punitive technology. I understand why that happened, but I think this is a potential sad turn. Although I think this may be a part of what we do see happen with some of these tools.
I think, first of all, thanks for your service. It's selfless people like you that keep so much of the community alive. I know a number of people that live like this, that don't have health care, who the ER is their health care. And it's a very difficult situation. I don't think we're going to solve it, but I will say that one of the major growth areas is mood and emotion software on your phones, and biofeedback coming from that, and reinforcement. You know, when you don't have a friend, when you're all alone, when you're depressed, it is the worst thing in the world. It's so isolating, and to have what the Japanese think a lot about as they're getting an aging population, having software robots, software pets, software friends who are there with you and can read your emotion. I mean, we have a whole center upstairs of social robots that actually can watch your face, put a neural network across your face, know exactly what your mood is, and then talk to you and move you from being frowning to being smiling. It's just software. And as that begins to be embedded, you know, in India, there's 600,000 villages. Today, almost everyone has cell phones. So this is it's not cell phones we make, it's the ones the Indians make that are inexpensive enough and service plans enough that they can get out there. I think that's something that's going to continue to happen, and that software and that emotive, you always have a friend. You always have someone who can be there for you and to improve your mood. I think this is one of the big areas that's developing now, but it takes not just computer scientists. This takes people from psychology, from cognitive science, from people who are in community service and so forth, who understand these problems, to work together as teams to come up with these kind of novel solutions. But I think there is hope there.
Didier Sagan. I'm a product manager in the wireless industry. And in fact, the question I have comes a bit follow what has been said just before. And you mentioned that the healthcare system is set to be reactive and avert to change. So mentioning that change will come by empowering people to take care of their own health. But what I've noticed is that most people, and mostly the people with chronic disease or the most at risk, are usually busy and will put taking care of their health as a very low priority until something goes wrong. So then they are again in that reactive mode for most of them. So in terms of empowering people to take care of their own health, how do you see what would be what will it take to jumpstart the system for mass adoption of that kind of change, where people will proactively monitor themselves and avoid disease before they have them?
Well, you're absolutely right. That's what needs to happen. Preventing the illness, or preventing, you know, let's say asthma, the very big burden in our country and throughout the world. And so if you have a sensor, it has to be seamless, right? And the sensor picks up all the relevant metrics, whether it be pollen count, air quality, your forced expiratory, your air movement, your oxygen saturation. It can tell before an asthma attack ever happens, long before, that you need to take inhaler or whatever to prevent it. That's the kind of thing we need, is things that are seamless in the person's existence. And the same thing would be someone who's already had heart failure, which is so prone to have heart failure again, to have some type of, the sensor to catch things before they happen. But they can't be intrusive into one's life. They have to be, because as your point is well taken, has to be something that they don't even know it's there essentially until they get the ringtone, that says you're going to have an asthma attack if you don't do this such and such right now.
Yeah, to follow that up, I think we talk about participatory medicine. I think there's a step beyond that, which is essentially non-participatory medicine, where things automatically happen, and the thing that's most valuable for you to do is the absolute easiest thing for you to do. And I'm pessimistic enough to believe that even that won't get it all done. I do think we need to make sure that incentives are aligned with the outcomes that we hope for and expect. Currently, our healthcare system is not overly incentivized to keep people well, because it's actually all the participants get paid when they're sick. And so, the doc gets paid when he sees you in the office. The hospital gets paid when you're a resident in the facility. And so, we have a perverse incentive alignment. I think as we incentivize, and for all of its limitations, accountable care organizations do provide some incentives for organizations to look out for you and to have you avoid those costly collisions between your chronic disease and their care facilities. And so I do think we can bend this a little bit in the direction of good by incentivizing you and your family to make sure that you are not sick. And incentivize your healthcare providers and the accountable care organizations around them, your medical home. All of that has to be tilted to keep you well, as opposed to what we have right now is tilted to benefit from you when you're sick.
Okay, we actually have another question from people watching online. And Gary, you mentioned that the rise of the ankle bracelet as a detrimental effect of this rise of tracking technology. And the question from Carol Togan is, what are your thoughts across the panel on the detrimental effects of tracking? And she gives an example of anorexics that go online to compete on who can eat the least amount of food. And I think the correlate question to that is, how can we as people working within the health field and the technology field and the healthcare field seek to minimize those possible detrimental effects?
Well, there are lots of detrimental potential effects. A digital dystopia of this type of information is possible, right? And that I never even thought of anorexics competing to lose weight. That was a new one, I have to say. But there's all the sorts of normal concerns when any of you have digitized information now on people, such as hacking, security, privacy, the data being used in the wrong way. So these are things. It's always about the trade-offs, and I think the trade-offs, if we work well together and plan this right, can be favorable. But there's always going to be a downside.
Hi, I'm Dave DeRiso. I'm part of the Institute for Neural Computation here at UCSD, and our lab is on the 6th floor of Cal IT2. And we're doing the social robotics you mentioned. Self-quant is becoming an emerging market. And what I'd like to know is, what are some of the barriers for this to become part of the standard of practice? Some of the things you mentioned were the physician research knowledge gap, reliability and availability of sensor technology, legal and regulatory restrictions, and also this physician power struggle. But what other things should we look to overcome?
Well, I think that we live in this smartphone app thing is historic. The social network is historic. We are never going back. And I think as Eric has said, this consumer liberation, the fact that it's fun to do this. You seek out and download apps. So occasionally even pay for them, right? And if you go out and look at the number of health apps, mood apps, they're just exploding. And so, power to the people. That's what's going to happen. It is happening. And so I think that this unleashing of innovation with this new platform to innovate on of iPhones, Androids, all of the global thinkers. I mean, most apps are developed by a person who has an idea, and they can just do it. I remember reading the newspaper when the first Australian app developer became a millionaire. It was front page news in Australia. Guess how many other Australians decided to be app developers that day? So I think we've never had, I mean, you mentioned 700,000 doctors. Well, that's a good big number out of 200 and 300 million people in America. A lot more folk could come on the playing field. And I think that's what's happening.
Hi, I'm Cece O'Connor from Panorama Innovation, and there's been some amazing insights here. And something I did recently was some research with elderly people who had healthcare issues, and spent some time, about 2.5 hours, at a home of a couple in their 80s who took me on a journey of their health. And they talked about, starting exercise in their 70s and starting to, really start measuring things, blood pressure. One of them developed diabetes, and so their blood sugar. And it wasn't until after about an hour and 50 minutes, and I'm sitting at their kitchen table, that they finally showed me. I said, "Is there anything else you measure? Where do you put this? Who do you talk to about it?" And they each had these amazing books where they were capturing everything. And they didn't know what to do with those books. And I thought, the real gap for me when I spend time with people like this is they don't know what to do with the data. And there's also, they hadn't shared it with their doctor. So this big bridge that needs to be built between the data and these people, and they're in their 80s doing this. And we don't think about people in their 80s doing it, but they were loving any technology they could get their hands on. So how do we build a bridge?
So what's what they're doing wrong is writing it on dead trees instead of uploading it into the cloud, in which case they would have plenty of folks who would share with them what those numbers meant, or I tried this and it made a difference. And so that's the radical difference of digitization. When things are bits, they are meant to be shared. And so that's why these sensors that automatically, like when I took my Fitbit, put it on my little thing, uploaded it to the cloud earlier today, graphed it all for me. Well, but it also is now in a cloud with tens of thousands of other people. And if I want to, I can find out exactly how am I doing for a 60-year-old male, 63-year-old male, relative to all other 63-year-old males in that cloud, right? And so the same goes for 80-year-olds. But you've got to share the data to the cloud so that it can be compared and then give you feedback, and then through the social networks have other people, other 85-year-olds say, wow, this is good. And by the way, great for you doing that, and you've inspired me to do it. And so this is where it's happening. It's in this virtual space now that didn't exist even 5 years ago.
Two more questions I think we can take. Hi, Benjamin Bratton, Center for Design and Geopolitics here at Cal IT2. My question also has to do with the cloud, and I'm going to take Gary's invitation to go a bit meta on this, on the discussion here. I was in the opportunity to talk in France a couple months ago, and I had gotten a discussion with someone about quantitative self and the rest of this, and he said, oh, well, this is such an American idea. The idea of the self as the primary and most important locus of analysis is such an American idea. Why not quantitative community or quantitative city or quantified ecology? And to this question of the sharing, I totally agree with it, to the sharing of the data and the pluralization of the data and the rest of this as this goes forward. does it not seem that we're sort of in this early stage of this? That is, we learn how to quantify experience, quantify biology, quantify the social network, and so forth, that the self may only be a kind of starting point.
Do you want to take your Well, I would just say, as it applies to, I mean, you could say, well, it's a very narcissistic thing. On the other hand, if you're applying it to healthcare, who has the most vested interest? And that really has to be oneself. So, you know, I think that as this is used in a way to preserve health, I don't see any other way out, that it's the individual, or if it's the parents, or, you know, the caregiver, whatever. That's where I think it has to emanate from.
Well, I just like to add, we hear that question a lot at the Quantified Self, and it's very hard, it's very easy to identify the self as just the individual. But of course, what you see people doing is taking their own individual measurements, sharing them with other people. The Quantified Self itself is people coming together to talk to each other and share and form a community. So there's our new types of communities arising through data. And that, I think, is the most magic thing happening here. I think it is interesting that it begins with the individual in many cases, because our cities and our systems and our communities as they exist today are in the hands of professional managers for the most part. So here you have new communities that are being formed sort of from the ground up. And at some point they will mix and contend with the communities that are already existing, and that will be a fun moment. One more. Whoever has the microphone gets to ask the last question.
Cool. All right. I guess I'll be speaking from the level of the individual. My name is Skye Christopherson. I'm 36 years old. 19 years old, I made the U.S. cycling team, and I moved to the U.S. Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs. I competed up until 2000, where I was an alternate on the Olympic team. And after that, I came to school here. So I'm an undergraduate alumni. Yeah. Go Tritons, woo! And after starting a company and kind of being sedentary for a little while, I came back to training, and I actually attended a TED conference about a year and a half ago, and I saw Dr. Topol talk about some of these wireless devices and quantification, predictive healthcare, and I just wanted to thank you, because that actually started kind of a series of events that ended up in a world record last summer. And what it was a Zayo sleep device. So, I mean, as an athlete, this stuff is second nature to me. I mean, we're always measuring our watts, our heart rate, our body temperature, calories, protein, you name it. So with the help of the training centers, I mean, I was pretty close to optimizing most components that resulted in performance. But the Zayo really uncovered something that gave me a big edge, and that was deep sleep. And so as an athlete, it's, given that you're not taking steroids to accelerate your recovery, sleep is so important. And I am drug-free. So, that's right, Lance Armstrong. But that's off record, by the way. So, yeah, and I mean, if you're curious, what it was the room temperature was affecting my deep sleep. I saw the trend from January down to the end of the spring dropping every month. I said, what on earth is going on? Turns out, my room was getting warmer. So I got a bed pad that circulated temperature-controlled water underneath me, just set the temperature 66 degrees, ended up being optimal for me. And that restored my deep sleep. And training just, really started responding to that. So thank you.
I love ending with a novel discovery. And that's what you'll find if you come to Quantified Self stuff. Thank you so much. What a great conversation, and thank you for participating in it. We'll talk more after.
So just because you all are here from San Diego, I can't let you leave without giving you a small but hopefully persuasive plug. We have 3 co-organizers here in the room. June and John, can you raise your hands? These two fine young people right here and myself co-organized Quantified Self San Diego. It's a meetup. It's free, although we might have a small donation because we're doing some really fun stuff with the Science Festival here at UCSD in Petco Park in March, where our next meetup is going to be in mid-March. We would love it if some of you would come and join our community of learners and self-experimenters and knowledge generators. And again, thank you all for coming. It's people like you that make events like this worthwhile. So thanks again.